What would make a royal hang up the phone on his own blood? Imagine this, a grandson, desperate and grieving, reaching out across the Atlantic in one of the most vulnerable moments of his life, only to be cut off mid-sentence. A dial tone echoing in his ear, a silence heavier than words. That, my friends, is the moment we are stepping into. The shocking truth behind Prince Harry's alleged plea to bring Meghan Markle to Catherine's royal funeral, and the Duke of Kent's cold, uncompromising rejection. Pause for a second. Can you feel the tension? Can you picture the weight of tradition, the icy grip of royal protocol, colliding head-on with the desperation of a man who has, time and time again, found himself on the outside looking in? This isn't just about a phone call. It's about the collision of grief, betrayal, and history repeating itself in ways that would make even the late Diana's story shiver through your mind. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Katherine, Duchess of Kent, lived a long life. 92 years of quiet grace, steadfast loyalty, and an often overlooked influence in the monarchy. She wasn't the loudest royal. She wasn't splashed across headlines every week. Yet, in her silence and dignity, she became a pillar, a connector of generations, a figure whose passing would demand unity, respect, and tradition. And yet, her death did the opposite. So here's the burning question. Why would Prince Harry, of all times, make such a call? Why risk the wrath of a family already estranged, already fractured, already weary of his choices? Was it love? Was it desperation? Or was it something darker, an insistence that Meghan, once again, be at the center of a royal occasion? Let's dig deeper. Picture the atmosphere in Windsor the moment the news broke. Flags lowered, whispers rippling through corridors that have seen centuries of history. Staffers rushing with black armbands, phones buzzing with calls of condolences, courtiers scrambling to prepare protocols for yet another royal funeral. The family itself, caught between private grief and public duty, gathered in muted rooms draped with sorrow. And yet, behind the scenes, another drama was unfolding. Because while the monarchy was preparing to bid farewell to Katherine, Prince Harry was dialing into the very heart of the institution that had once been his home, now a fortress of cold shoulders. He wasn't just calling to mourn. He was calling to negotiate, to argue, to plead. And that, my friends, is where everything went wrong. You see, the Duke of Kent isn't just a relative. He's a man known for his old-school loyalty to the crown, a guardian of tradition, a protector of protocol, a man who has weathered scandals, wars, and royal divorces, always keeping his eyes firmly on duty. And when Harry's voice, crackling down the line from Montecito, broke that silence with one request, to bring Meghan to Catherine's funeral, it struck a nerve so deep it could only end in rejection. But here's the irony. Harry wasn't wrong to want his wife by his side. Grief is unbearable when faced alone. Have you ever been at a funeral, surrounded by family, and yet felt utterly isolated? Harry knew that feeling too well. Meghan was his support system, his shield. To face the icy stares of his family without her would have been a torment he could barely endure. Yet, for the royals, this wasn't about comfort. It was about symbolism. Meghan, still blamed by many for the Oprah interview, for the Netflix bombshells, for the rift that split the brothers apart, was viewed as an intruder, a disruption, a wound that hadn't healed. Allowing her presence at a moment of solemnity, in the eyes of the Duke of Kent, would dishonor Catherine's memory. So what do you do when grief collides with anger? When family collides with duty? When love collides with tradition? That's the heart of this story. And let's not pretend the public wasn't waiting for drama. Every camera lens was ready to capture Harry's face, Meghan's absence, or perhaps her bold arrival if he had succeeded. Every headline was poised to twist the narrative, either a reconciliation or another scandal. Harry knew this. Meghan knew this. And the Duke of Kent knew this. That is why, after a few tense words, the phone call ended. Not with understanding, not with compromise, but with a sharp, deliberate cut. The Duke of Kent hung up on Harry. Imagine the sting, the shock, the disbelief of hearing nothing but a dead line, knowing the conversation was over before it had truly begun. But before we go any further, ask yourself, was the Duke being cruel, or was he protecting something greater than Harry's feelings? Was this about punishing a grandson, or preserving the monarchy itself? Because in that one act of rejection, centuries of royal struggle came roaring back. The monarchy has always wrestled with outsiders. Wallis Simpson, Camilla in her early years, even Diana in her own way. Outsiders who disrupted, who demanded space in a system built on secrecy and order. Meghan was no different in their eyes. And Harry's desperate phone call reminded the Duke of Kent that once you let disruption inside sacred rituals, you risk dismantling the very foundation that keeps the crown standing. But here's the real twist. This phone call didn't just expose Harry's vulnerability. It exposed the monarchy's too. For if the monarchy is so fragile that the presence of one woman could overshadow a funeral, what does that say about its strength? The world was about to watch a funeral, a moment meant for unity. Yet whispers of that cut-off call had already begun to circulate, shaping narratives before the first black carriage even rolled. Some saw Harry as pitiful, begging for compassion. Others saw him as arrogant, demanding exceptions. And through it all, Meghan's name loomed like a shadow, absent yet omnipresent. So let me ask you, if you were Harry, would you have made that call? Would you have dared risk humiliation for the chance of standing united, arm in arm with the woman you love? Or would you have stayed silent, swallowed the loneliness, and faced the monarchy alone? Because that decision, to dial or not to dial, changed everything. It wasn't just about grief. It wasn't just about family. It was about power, perception, and the bitter truth that even in mourning, the royal family cannot escape its own divisions. But what happened after the call, what Harry did next, how Meghan responded behind closed doors, and how the family maneuvered in the days leading up to the funeral, was a story no one saw coming. And that, dear viewers, is where the curtain rises on the chaos behind Katherine's final farewell. Because the call was only the beginning. The storm was yet to come. The end of a royal era often begins quietly. There are no trumpets, no grand pronouncements, no pageantry. Instead, it creeps in on hushed voices, the dimming of lights in palace corridors, and the shuffling of staff who know, but do not dare speak aloud, that the end is near. That is how it was with Katherine, Duchess of Kent, in her final days. 92 years of life, service, and sacrifice distilled into those silent moments when a once vibrant figure slowly slipped into history. Now, here's the first shock that many overlook. Katherine wasn't a flashy royal. She wasn't like Diana, adored for her charisma, nor like Meghan, polarizing and endlessly scrutinized. No, Katherine was something rarer. She was steady, reliable, unshakable. For decades, she moved through royal life with a quiet dignity that rarely made the tabloids. And yet, in those final days, as her health waned, her absence was felt like a missing cornerstone. Imagine Windsor Castle during those days. Behind the walls, whispers carried through the halls, staff checking for updates, courtiers briefing one another in low tones. For the younger royals, she was a grandmotherly presence. For the older ones, she was a bridge to a bygone era, a woman who had weathered storms and seen the monarchy bend but not break. But here's the twist. Even as she neared the end, the family was already fracturing around her. Katherine's decline coincided with a period of chaos for the monarchy. King Charles's reign still finding its footing, William shouldering more responsibility than ever, Harry and Meghan thundering from across the Atlantic with interviews, books, and allegations. Katherine's final chapter became a cruel metaphor, an elder leaving just as the cracks in the royal family deepened. So let's ask the hard question, what did Katherine know? Did she sense that her death would not be a moment of unity, but of division? Did she foresee that instead of her life being honored with dignity, her funeral would become yet another battleground in the never-ending war between Harry, Meghan, and the monarchy? Because make no mistake, Katherine was no fool. She had lived through more scandals than most could imagine. She had seen the abdication crisis ripple through her youth. She had witnessed the shattering of Charles and Diana's marriage. She had observed, up close, the way the crown always survives, but individuals pay the cost. And yet, for all her insight, she chose silence. Katherine wasn't one for speeches or public declarations. But in those final days, those close to her noted something unusual, moments of reflection, quiet conversations, as though she was passing on fragments of wisdom to the next generation. Imagine the weight of those words. whispered to a child or grandchild by a woman who knew her time was almost up. Now picture Harry in Montecito, scrolling through news updates, learning of Catherine's decline. The man who had once walked those same corridors as a child, playing hide-and-seek in the royal gardens, was now oceans away, cut off, disconnected, and perhaps, for the first time, realizing that the royals he had turned his back on were slipping away one by one. Here's the irony. Katherine had once been one of the more sympathetic figures to Harry. Known for her softer touch, her ability to connect beyond rigid protocol, she had a quiet fondness for those who struggled to fit the royal mold. In some ways, she embodied the compassion Harry had always craved from the institution. Her death was not just a family loss. It was the extinguishing of one of the last links to the royal world Harry might have trusted. But while Harry processed this from afar, the royals in Britain prepared for the inevitable. Black folders were pulled from drawers, containing funeral protocols crafted years in advance. The operation name, "Every royal has one for their passing," was whispered among staff. Schedules were rearranged, courtiers informed. The world hadn't yet been told, but the machinery of monarchy was already in motion. And that's where the drama begins. Because as Catherine's final hours ticked away, the family wasn't gathered in unity. They were scattered. Charles focused on state matters. William occupied with his growing role. Harry in California, disconnected yet restless. The stage was being set not just for a farewell, but for a confrontation. Let me ask you, do you believe in fate? Because the timing of Catherine's death could not have been more fateful. Just as the monarchy needed an anchor of stability, she was gone. Just as the family needed a unifying figure, she slipped away. And just as Harry's alienation reached its peak, the one royal who might have softened his pain was no longer there. But Catherine's death wasn't just about timing. It was about legacy. Who was she, really? To many, she was overshadowed by flashier royals. But peel back the layers, and you find a woman who dedicated herself to causes others ignored: music, education, and children. She had once broken with tradition herself, quietly converting to Catholicism, defying the rigid expectations of her role. In her own quiet way, she had been a rebel. And that's the cruel irony. The very institution she served, the monarchy she upheld, would fracture in her absence over the very things she herself had once navigated with grace: faith, outsiders, and tradition. Now, think about this. The world outside those palace gates had no idea. As Catherine's final days passed, the public went about their lives, unaware that soon they would be mourning a duchess. Unaware that soon, the cameras would descend. And most of all, unaware that her funeral would become the backdrop for one of the most explosive royal rifts in modern history. Because here's where the story turns. As Catherine's health declined, Harry made his decision. He would not just mourn from afar. He would call. He would demand a place for Meghan at her funeral. A moment of desperation that would lead to the now infamous phone call. But before that call, before the hang-up, before the headlines, there were those final days. Quiet, sorrowful, and pregnant with the weight of history. Days that marked the end of an era and the beginning of another royal crisis. So here we are, Catherine's life closing like the final chapter of a beloved book, while another story, chaotic, scandalous, and heartbreaking, was about to be written. Because what happened after her passing wasn't just mourning. It was division, betrayal, and a family tearing itself apart while the world watched. But the phone call was coming. And with it, a confrontation no one expected. The cliffhanger is here. The Duchess is gone. The funeral is looming. And Harry is reaching for the phone. But the question is, who would answer? And how would they respond? The announcement of a royal death is never just an announcement. It is a performance. It is a ritual. It is centuries of tradition condensed into a single moment that must convey dignity, sorrow, and unshakable continuity all at once. And when the world learned of the passing of Katherine, Duchess of Kent, at the age of 92, the words carried a weight far heavier than the paper they were written on. Her Grace, the Duchess of Kent, passed away peacefully. That was the official line. Polished, sanitized, stripped of emotion. But behind those carefully chosen words was a storm brewing, a fracture widening, and a family grappling not just with grief, but with scandal. Ask yourself this. Why does it matter so much how the death of a royal is announced? Why the formality, the rehearsed lines, the controlled release of information? Because for the monarchy, image is survival. One wrong word, one misstep in tone, and centuries of tradition begin to look fragile. And in this case, the announcement had to do more than report a death. It had to conceal the tension that was already bubbling beneath the surface. Picture it. The press offices at Buckingham Palace, staff glued to their desks, fingers tapping furiously at keyboards. Draft after draft of the announcement written, edited, debated. Should they call her beloved? Should they emphasize her service? Should they mention her charitable work, her quiet faith, her loyalty? Every word mattered because every word shaped how the public would mourn. But while the palace agonized over phrasing, the news began to trickle out. Journalists whispered among themselves, tipped off by sources who always seem to know before the official word drops. And so, when the announcement finally hit, the public wasn't shocked, it was braced. Yet braced or not, the gravity of the moment landed. A duchess was gone. Now, here's the twist most people missed. The family wasn't unified in grief. In fact, the announcement only highlighted how divided they were. Some royals issued their own statements almost immediately, heartfelt, personal, touching. Others stayed silent, their silence speaking louder than words. And then there was Harry, oceans away, watching the news break not from palace corridors, but from a California mansion. Think about that for a moment. Once upon a time, Harry would have been among the first to know. He would have been called into a private room, sat down gently, and told by a senior royal or aide. But this time, he was informed like the rest of us, through a screen. Can you imagine that sting? To learn of your grandmotherly figures passing through the media, stripped of intimacy, stripped of belonging? And then came the public reaction. Crowds gathered outside Windsor and Buckingham Palace, laying flowers, bowing heads, whispering prayers. For many, Catherine's death was the end of an era, a reminder of how fleeting stability can be. And yet, mingled with the mourning was curiosity. Who would attend the funeral? Who would stand shoulder to shoulder? Would Harry come? Would Meghan dare? Let's not gloss over the media frenzy. Within hours of the announcement, headlines blared not just about Catherine's life, but about the fractured royal family. Will Harry return? Meghan snubbed again. Duke of Kent steps in. The Duchess's death became the backdrop for yet another round of speculation, scandal, and family politics. But here's where it gets darker. The palace, in its announcement, had a choice: to invite unity or to emphasize separation. And some insiders claimed the wording was deliberate. Subtle cues in the phrasing, subtle omissions, designed to signal who was in and who was out. It was as if Catherine's death became another chess move in the monarchy's endless game of optics. Meanwhile, Harry's phone buzzed with calls from friends, from sympathetic voices, from journalists pretending to offer condolences while fishing for quotes. And in that moment, Harry was caught in a dilemma: remain silent and appear cold, or issue a statement and risk being accused of making it about himself. Either way, the announcement had trapped him in a corner. Let's pause here and ask, how do you grieve when your grief is politicized? When every tear you shed, every word you speak, every silence you hold becomes ammunition for others. That was the reality Harry faced the moment the announcement was made. Now, contrast that with Meghan's situation. To her, the announcement was another reminder of exclusion. No mention of her. No recognition of her role as Harry's wife. To the palace, she remained invisible. But invisibility cuts both ways. For Meghan, being left out of the narrative wasn't just an insult. It was an opportunity to craft her own story. And behind closed doors, she began pressing Harry. Don't let them silence us. Don't let them erase me. And that, dear viewers, is where the tension sharpened. Because the announcement wasn't the end of the story, it was the beginning. It set the stage for the funeral. It set the stage for Harry's desperation. It set the stage for the phone call that would come crashing through tradition like a hammer through glass. But before the phone call, there were whispers. The announcement had barely settled into the headlines when palace insiders began leaking details. Some claimed Harry had called immediately after hearing the news, begging for information. Others claimed he was excluded from early funeral discussions. The truth? Likely somewhere in between. But perception matters, and the perception was clear. Harry was on the outside. Now, let's peel back another layer. Catherine's passing didn't just mark the loss of a duchess. It marked the loss of one of the last figures of her generation, a generation of royals who still commanded respect without controversy. With her gone, the monarchy's image rested on Charles, William, and, unavoidably, Harry. That's why the announcement mattered. Because it wasn't just telling the world that Catherine had died. It was signaling who would shape the monarchy's future. And here's where the cliffhanger lies. Because as the announcement echoed through, he wasn't calling to mourn. He was calling to negotiate, to demand, to plead for Meghan's inclusion. And on the other end of the line was the Duke of Kent, stern, uncompromising, unwilling to bend. What happened next would ignite the storm. Not the grand toll of a bell from Westminster Abbey. Not the solemn chime of a cathedral. No, just a shrill, ordinary ring on a private line. Yet in that ring lay the weight of desperation, grief, and the unbearable need of a man caught between two worlds. Prince Harry, sitting thousands of miles away in Montecito, California, had decided to pick up the phone. He was going to call back into the institution he had fled. He was going to ask for something that he surely knew would ignite fury. And on the other end of that line would be the Duke of Kent, guardian of tradition, custodian of protocol, and a man who had no patience for royal dramatics. Pause for a second and picture the scene. Harry, pacing back and forth in his Californian mansion, the Pacific sun glowing outside the windows. Meghan, tense, perhaps urging him on. Call them. Don't let them shut us out. His fingers hovering over the screen, doubt gnawing at him, before he finally pressed call. A simple action, but one that would unleash a tidal wave of consequences. Now let's ask the obvious question. Why call at all? Why not stay silent, fly back quietly, and attend the funeral like any other royal family member? The answer, my friends, is simple and brutal. Harry couldn't bear the thought of walking into that funeral alone. Remember his last royal farewell, the funeral of Prince Philip, where Meghan was absent. Harry looked isolated, awkward, cast off to the side. Then the funeral of Queen Elizabeth II, when the eyes of the world watched him stride behind the coffin, stiff and out of place. He knew what it felt like to be the outcast in moments of grief. He knew what it meant to be without Meghan's support, facing the frosty stares of his own blood. This time, he wasn't willing to endure that. So he called. "Your Grace, it's Harry." His voice was low, tight, edged with that vulnerability that only surfaces in grief. On the other end, the Duke of Kent's response was measured, formal. Harry, just his name. No warmth, no small talk. And then, without delay, Harry launched into it. He spoke of his grief. He spoke of Catherine's kindness. He spoke of his need to be there for the funeral. But then, the request slipped out, almost hidden at first, then bolder as he went on. He wanted Meghan there too. He insisted she stand beside him, not just as his wife, but as his anchor in this storm. Think about that. Harry wasn't just asking to attend. He was asking to bring the very woman who, in the eyes of many royals, had set fire to the monarchy's dignity. The woman who, through interviews, Netflix documentaries, and memoirs, had turned the palace into a punching bag for global gossip. He was asking to place Meghan in the front row of royal grief, in full view of cameras and courtiers. Now imagine the silence on the other end of that call. A silence so heavy that it crackled through the line. The Duke of Kent, stoic, bound by decades of loyalty to the crown, listening, perhaps gripping the receiver tighter. Finally, his voice came, sharp and unyielding. "No, Harry. Absolutely not." Harry's breath caught. He pushed back. He pleaded. He reminded the Duke that Meghan was his wife, that he couldn't mourn properly without her. His words tumbled out, a mixture of sorrow and desperation. "Please, she's my family too. She needs to be there with me. I can't do this alone." But the Duke didn't bend. His tone grew colder. "This is not about what you want. This is about respect. Respect for Catherine. Respect for the crown. Meghan will not be at the funeral." Now here's where the story takes an even darker turn. Some insiders whispered that Harry, in that moment, grew angry. His grief collided with rage. He reminded the Duke of his mother, of how Diana had been cast aside, of how Meghan was being treated the same way. "You're repeating history," he reportedly snapped. "You're making the same mistakes all over again." But the Duke was unmoved. He was not a man swayed by emotion or threats. He represented tradition, and tradition would not allow Meghan's presence. He cut across Harry's words, blunt and final. This conversation is over. And then, it happened. The line went dead. The Duke had hung up. Can you imagine that moment for Harry? The disbelief. The humiliation. 1 second, he was begging, pleading for compassion. The next, nothing but silence. No compromise. No understanding. Just rejection. A click that reverberated louder than any insult. And Meghan? Picture her in the room, listening, waiting for Harry to hang up and tell her it was settled. Instead, she saw his face fall. She saw the color drain from his expression. She heard the echo of the deadline. And in that instant, her fury must have ignited. But here's the question I want to put to you. Was the Duke cruel, or was he right? Was he protecting the sanctity of the funeral, ensuring it would not be overshadowed by cameras flashing at Meghan? Or was he punishing Harry, wielding power in the cruelest way possible at the moment of his grief? This was no ordinary phone call. This was a battle of wills. On one side, a grandson desperate for support. On the other, a Duke who saw himself as protector of tradition. And the decision, made in the span of minutes, would ripple into headlines, family rifts, and whispered conversations across the palace halls. But the most haunting part? The call didn't end the tension. It ignited it. Harry wasn't finished. Meghan wasn't finished. And the royals, already fractured, were about to be pulled into yet another storm. Because what Harry did after that call, and how Meghan responded behind closed doors, would only escalate the drama. And the funeral itself? That was yet to come. A stage where absence would scream louder than presence. The line was cut. The call was over. But the story, the story was only beginning. It takes a certain kind of man to reject a grieving grandson. A certain kind of resolve. A certain kind of cold, steel-edged loyalty to the crown. That man was the Duke of Kent. And his rejection of Harry's plea wasn't just a matter of no. It was a rejection drenched in history, tradition, and a simmering distrust that had been building for years. Picture it. The Duke of Kent sitting in his study, the phone still warm in his hand after cutting the line. His jaw set, his eyes unwavering. To him, this wasn't cruelty. This wasn't spite. This was duty. A funeral, in his mind, was no place for theatrics, no place for spectacle, and certainly no place for Meghan Markle. Let's ask the question straight. Why would the Duke be so absolute, so unmovable? Why hang up on Harry rather than negotiate, rather than extend compassion? The answer lies in who the Duke is. He is the last of his breed, the old guard of the monarchy, a man raised in the shadow of abdication crises, who saw firsthand how outsiders could destabilize the throne. To him, Harry's request wasn't just about a wife's presence at a funeral. It was a threat to the very sanctity of royal tradition. And so, when Harry pleaded, when his voice cracked with desperation, the Duke heard not grief, but a challenge. A challenge to authority. A challenge to the hierarchy. A challenge to the monarchy itself. But let's not pretend this rejection didn't cut Harry to the bone. Imagine standing at the crossroads of grief and humiliation. On one side, the funeral of a family matriarch who represented compassion and kindness. On the other, a flat refusal that underscored how far he had fallen from grace. The Duke's rejection wasn't just a no. It was a reminder, you are not one of us anymore. Now, think about Meghan in this scenario. For her, the Duke's decision was confirmation of everything she had always said, that the monarchy would never accept her, never embrace her, never allow her a place at the table. To Meghan, this wasn't just rejection. This was proof. Proof that the institution was archaic, cruel, and unwilling to evolve. And if Harry felt pain, Meghan felt vindicated. But what about the rest of the family? Do you think they rallied behind Harry? Absolutely not. The whispers within the palace were reportedly supportive of the Duke's stance. He did the right thing, some said. He protected Catherine's memory, others claimed. In their eyes, the funeral was sacred. Meghan's presence, they believed, would have overshadowed the solemnity, turning it into a circus of flashing cameras and commentary. And yet, here's the contradiction. The very act of rejecting Meghan created the very spectacle they had hoped to avoid. Because once word of Harry's rejection began to seep out, through whispers, leaks, and subtle nods in the press, it became the story. Headlines blared. Harry pleads, Duke refuses. Meghan banned from funeral. The world's focus shifted from Catherine's legacy to Harry's humiliation. Now ask yourself, was that worth it? Was denying Meghan's presence truly about respect for Catherine, or was it about control? Was it about ensuring the monarchy maintained its grip on optics, even if it meant fracturing a grandson's heart? Let's rewind for a moment. Think about other outsiders in royal history. Wallis Simpson, denied acceptance, cast into exile with Edward VIII. Camilla, once reviled, kept in the shadows for decades before slowly, painstakingly being accepted. Even Diana, beloved by the public but resented within palace walls for her refusal to conform. Each of them, in their own way, challenged the institution. And each was, at one point, rejected. Meghan's story was just the latest chapter in this pattern. The Duke of Kent knew this history. He had lived it. He had seen what happened when outsiders gained too much influence, when tradition was compromised for personal desire. And so, to him, the decision was simple. Harsh, perhaps. Heartbreaking, certainly. But necessary. Still, let's not underestimate the cruelty of that phone call. Harry's voice, heavy with grief, reaching across oceans, only to be silenced. Cut off. Hung up on. A man desperate to be heard. Denied by the very family that should have offered comfort. Do you feel the sting of that? Because Harry did. He felt it deeply. And it's that sting, that wound, that would shape every step he took afterward. Every look he gave at the funeral. Every whisper Meghan shared behind closed doors. But here's the deeper tragedy. Catherine herself, in life, had been a figure of compassion. She was known for her kindness, her ability to connect beyond protocol. She had even defied expectations herself, converting to Catholicism in a move that raised eyebrows but spoke to her authenticity. Would she have wanted Meghan excluded? Would she have wanted Harry humiliated? We may never know. But the irony is bitter. The funeral of a woman defined by quiet grace became the setting for harsh rejection. And so the question lingers. Was the Duke right? Or was he wrong? Was this about protecting tradition? Or was it about punishing Harry one last time? One thing is certain. The rejection was final. The door slammed shut. Meghan would not be at the funeral. Harry would face his family alone. And the world would watch, not just for Catherine's farewell, but for the cracks in the royal facade. Because what came next wasn't reconciliation. It wasn't healing. It was fury. Fury from Meghan, heartbreak from Harry, and whispers in palace corridors that the rift was now permanent. And in the days that followed, as arrangements were made, as black suits and veils were prepared, Harry and Meghan found themselves on opposite sides of a wall taller than ever before. The rejection was complete. But the fallout? That was only beginning. Because Meghan's reaction behind closed doors was not silence. It was fire. And what she did next threatened to overshadow the funeral entirely. Have you ever seen someone's face when humiliation hardens into fury? When rejection doesn't bring tears, but sparks? That was Meghan Markle, behind closed doors, the moment Harry told her what had happened. The Duke of Kent hadn't just said no. He had slammed the door on her, cut Harry off mid-sentence, and made it clear that she was persona non grata at Catherine's funeral. For Meghan, it wasn't simply exclusion. It was war. Imagine the scene. Harry, phone still in hand, pale, shaken. His voice heavy as he muttered. He hung up. He said, "You're not welcome." A silence fills the Montecito living room. Meghan, at first stunned, then slowly standing, her hands clenched, her jaw set. To Harry, it was grief upon grief. To Meghan, it was vindication of everything she had always claimed, that the monarchy would never accept her, never respect her, never allow her in. But Meghan was not the type to crumble. She was the type to plot. And as the first tears pricked Harry's eyes, Meghan's mind was already racing. Let's pause here. Ask yourself, if you had been humiliated like that, if an ancient institution had effectively declared you a ghost, invisible, unworthy, what would you do? Would you retreat in silence? Or would you fight back? Meghan, by every account, chose the latter. Behind closed doors, her reaction was fiery. She reportedly raised her voice, railing against the hypocrisy of a family that preached compassion but practiced exclusion. She reminded Harry of every slight they had endured, from the tabloids branding her Duchess difficult, to the insinuations about Archie's skin color, to the icy stares at royal gatherings. "Do you see now?" she is said to have told him. "They'll never let us in. Never." And Harry? Torn. Always torn. He loved Meghan. He needed her. He also longed for his family, for connection, for healing. In that moment, he was caught between his grief for Katherine and the storm building in his own home. His voice cracked as he tried to reason, but Meghan was past reasoning. To her, this was personal. The rage wasn't just about being banned from a funeral. It was about being silenced again. Imagine standing beside your husband through every storm, only to be told that in his darkest hour, you must remain invisible. Meghan's pride, her identity, her very sense of self was under attack. And she wasn't going to take it quietly. But here's where the story deepens. Meghan's fury wasn't just emotional, it was strategic. She began weighing options, discussing with Harry whether to release a statement, whether to let the world know she was being banned. If they want to make me the villain, she might have said, then the world should know the truth. Harry resisted. He feared that speaking out would only inflame tensions further, only widen the chasm between him and his family. But Meghan, behind closed doors, saw it differently. Silence had never protected her. Only narrative, only controlling the story, had given her a shield. And so, while the palace moved forward with funeral plans, Meghan and Harry argued, debated, whispered into the night about how to respond. Do they stay quiet and let the world assume she chose not to attend? Or do they leak the truth, that she was banned? But let's not overlook the emotional toll. Meghan reportedly wept, not just from anger, but from sorrow. She had imagined standing beside Harry, offering comfort, being seen as his equal in grief. Now, she was being cast as an outsider yet again. And the pain of that, layered on top of years of rejection, cut deeper than any headline. Still, Meghan's fire never burned out. She turned her pain into resolve. And in those private moments, she pushed Harry harder than ever to stand up for her. If you let this go, you let them win, she told him. If you let them erase me from this moment, they'll erase me forever. Now ask yourself, was Meghan wrong? Or was she simply fighting the fight any of us would fight if we were repeatedly excluded from the family we married into? Was her fury selfish, or was it survival? The royals, meanwhile, had no idea what storm was brewing behind those Montecito walls. To them, the rejection was final, settled, done. Meghan would not be at the funeral, but they underestimated her. They underestimated her will, her pride, her refusal to be silenced. And Harry? Torn apart, between his loyalty to Meghan and his longing for family, between the fire of his wife's fury and the ice of his family's rejection. He was a man split in two, his heart dragged in opposite directions. This is the tragedy, isn't it? A funeral meant to honor Katherine's legacy was already overshadowed by anger and division. A moment that should have united was instead tearing deeper fissures into the royal family. But here's the cliffhanger. Meghan's fury did not stop at words. It fueled actions. It fueled plans. And whispers began to emerge, not just of Harry attending alone, but of Meghan ensuring her presence would be felt, even if she wasn't physically there. Whether through subtle leaks, through friends speaking to the press, or through carefully crafted silence that screamed louder than words, Meghan was preparing her move. Because being excluded was one thing, being erased was another, and Meghan Markle was not about to be erased. Royal protocol. Two simple words, but in the House of Windsor, they carry the force of law. They are the invisible chains that bind every prince, duchess, and monarch to the past, dictating not just what they wear, how they walk, or when they speak, but who is allowed to stand at the side of the grieving. And in the days following Katherine's death, those chains tightened around Prince Harry like a vice. Think about it. For Harry, grief was personal. For the monarchy, grief was performance. There are rules, centuries old, for how royal funerals unfold. Rules about attire. Rules about order of procession. Rules about who walks where, who sits where, who enters, and who stays outside. And in those rules, Meghan Markle had no place. That's what Harry was really up against. Not just the Duke of Kent's willpower, not just his family's disdain, but the crushing weight of royal protocol. Let me ask you this. If you were told you couldn't have your spouse with you at your grandmother's funeral, would you accept it? Would you bow to tradition? Or would you fight back? Harry chose to fight. He argued. He pleaded. He begged. But every time he made his case, protocol answered him with silence. Because according to palace insiders, there were three core reasons Meghan was barred, and all three were rooted in the machinery of royal tradition. First, precedent. No royal funeral, particularly of a Duchess of Catherine's stature, had ever allowed a controversial outsider to overshadow the event. Funerals are supposed to be about continuity, not disruption. The Duke of Kent knew this. The courtiers knew this. Even King Charles, though silent, knew it. Meghan's presence, by this logic, would shatter precedent. Second, optics. Imagine the cameras. Imagine the tabloids. The moment Meghan stepped out of a car, the focus would shift from Catherine's life to Meghan's face. Every glance, every whisper, every raised eyebrow would be dissected. And the monarchy, already fragile in the wake of Elizabeth II's passing, couldn't risk another spectacle. Third, trust. Meghan had burned too many bridges. The Oprah interview, the Netflix series, Harry's memoir Spare. Each one had been seen by the royals as a betrayal. To them, she was not just unwelcome, she was dangerous. Letting her in meant risking another tell-all, another leak, another humiliation. So, from the perspective of royal protocol, the decision was clear. No Meghan. But Harry didn't see it that way. To him, these weren't rules. They were excuses. Excuses to punish him, to punish Meghan, to make him feel smaller and more estranged than ever before. He lashed out. He reminded them of Catherine's compassion, her history of defying expectations, her willingness to show kindness where others would not. She wouldn't have wanted this, Harry might have argued. She would have wanted unity. And perhaps he was right. But in the palace, tradition always outweighs sentiment. Now let's pull back for a moment. Why does this matter so much? Because royal protocol isn't just about order. It's about survival. The monarchy has lasted for centuries not because it bends, but because it resists. Every crack in tradition is seen as a threat to the entire structure. And Harry's plea for Meghan's inclusion wasn't seen as a husband's request. It was seen as an attack on the very institution itself. But here's the contradiction that makes this story burn. The more the palace clung to protocol, the more they looked heartless. To the public, Harry's plea was human, relatable. He wanted his wife with him. Who wouldn't? And the Duke of Kent's refusal, steeped in protocol, looked like cruelty. A battle between humanity and tradition, one that made the monarchy appear colder than ever. So what happened in those days? Harry pushed. The Duke pushed back harder. Meghan fumed. And the courtiers braced for impact. Behind the palace walls, the debates raged. Could they bend the rules, just this once? Should they risk it? Some argued yes. Let Meghan come. Better to have her inside the tent than outside it, stirring the storm. But others were adamant. This is about Katherine, not Meghan, one source reportedly said. We cannot allow her to turn this into her stage. And so, Protocol 1. Harry was told, again and again, in clipped tones and icy words, Meghan would not attend. His pleas fell on deaf ears. His arguments were dismissed. His grief, they believed, was clouding his judgment. And yet, deep down, Harry knew this wasn't just about protocol. It was about power. It was about reminding him, once more, that he no longer held any. But here's the twist. The very rules meant to silence Meghan ended up amplifying her. Because the moment the world learned she was excluded, curiosity exploded. Why wasn't she there? Was she banned? Did she refuse? Did she not care? Every headline, every panel discussion, every social media thread was about Meghan. The very thing the palace had sought to avoid had been unleashed by their own rigidity. That's the irony of royal protocol. It preserves, yes, but sometimes it also destroys. And Harry? He was left to face a reality more brutal than any headline. He would attend the funeral alone. He would walk into the abbey without Meghan at his side. He would sit among family who barely spoke to him, his every gesture scrutinized, his loneliness magnified. Imagine that. Imagine grieving with cameras on your face, millions watching, and the one person who gives you comfort forbidden from standing beside you. But here's the cliffhanger. Protocol may have won the battle, but the war was only beginning. Because Harry's isolation at the funeral and Meghan's absence would not end the story. They would fuel it. They would feed the fury behind closed doors, and they would set the stage for the next act of the drama. Because once the funeral was over, once the veils were lifted and the carriages rolled away, the fallout would begin. And that fallout would tear the family even further apart. Tension doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simmers, slow, quiet, invisible to the outside world until the pressure builds too high and it bursts. That's exactly what happened in the days leading up to Catherine's funeral. On the surface, the royal family presented their usual mask of dignity, rehearsed statements of grief, carefully crafted tributes, and black attire being pressed for the cameras. But beneath that mask, the fractures widened, the old wounds reopened, and the family's bitterness boiled over. Catherine's passing, instead of uniting them, reignited battles that had been smoldering for years. And at the heart of it all was Harry. Picture Windsor Castle in those days. Heavy curtains drawn, rooms filled with silence, broken only by the shuffle of aides and the faint echo of hushed conversations. But within those walls, the royals weren't speaking openly to Harry. The rejection of Meghan had already set the tone. Harry was an outsider, tolerated but not embraced. Every message, every exchange with him was clipped, formal, as though they were speaking not to a son, a brother, a grandson, but to a stranger who had crossed the line one too many times. Now, let's be clear, these tensions didn't begin with Catherine's death. They had been festering since Harry and Meghan's departure in 2020, since the Oprah interview, since Spare. Each book, each documentary, each explosive claim had added layers to the resentment. Catherine's funeral merely provided the stage for those resentments to flare in the harshest light possible. William, for one, was furious. Not publicly, never publicly, but insiders whispered that his patience with Harry had run dry. To him, Harry's plea to bring Meghan was proof of everything he had always suspected, that Harry couldn't let go of drama, that even in grief, he would put himself at the center. William's icy stance, according to sources, was clear. Meghan's absence was non-negotiable, and Harry should accept it without complaint. But Charles? Charles was different. Grieving his cousin, burdened with his role as monarch, he reportedly avoided direct confrontation with Harry altogether. Silence was his shield. Silence was his weapon. He neither supported Harry's request nor openly condemned it. But to Harry, that silence was betrayal. A father who could not, or would not, stand up for his son. And Princess Anne, ever the pragmatist, her view was blunt. Funerals are not about personal feelings. They're about duty. Her sharp practicality left no room for Harry's pleas, no room for Meghan's inclusion. To her, this wasn't cruelty. It was reality. Now, think about this dynamic. Harry, grieving, isolated, pleading for compassion, and his family, cold, formal, resolute. Have you ever been in a family argument where every word you say feels like it's falling into a void, unheard, dismissed? That was Harry's reality. And Meghan? Though barred from the funeral, her presence loomed large. Her fury behind closed doors seeped into Harry's tone, his body language, his insistence. The family knew it. They sensed it. They spoke of it in whispers, saying Harry wasn't speaking only for himself. He was speaking for Meghan. That made them even less inclined to listen. But here's the thing. Funerals don't just stir present emotions. They stir old ones too. And Catherine's funeral was no exception. For William and Harry, the memories of their mother's funeral came rushing back. The sight of black suits, the smell of lilies, the sound of footsteps echoing on stone floors. For William, it solidified his duty. For Harry, it reopened his wounds. The comparisons to Diana were inevitable, and they widened the gulf between the brothers once more. Let's not forget the courtiers, those ever-present guardians of the crown, whispering in the background, fanning the flames. Some of them openly questioned whether Harry should even attend if Meghan wasn't allowed. Others strategized about seating arrangements, fearing Harry might cause a scene, or worse, be seen as pitiful. Every detail, from pew placement to order of procession, became a battlefield. Now ask yourself, what happens when grief collides with resentment? When a family already fractured is forced to gather under the world's gaze? The answer is simple. Every glance, every whisper, every silent refusal becomes a dagger. And yet, through it all, Harry held firm. He would attend. He would mourn Katherine. He would walk into that abbey alone if he had to. But his very presence reignited the family tensions that had never truly healed. William's anger, Charles's silence, Anne's disdain, the Duke of Kent's coldness. They all pressed down on him like a weight he couldn't escape. Meanwhile, Meghan's absence screamed louder than her presence ever could. The world asked, where is she? Why isn't she here? The palace's hope of avoiding spectacle had backfired. Once again, Meghan was at the center of the story, even from thousands of miles away. This, dear viewers, is the tragedy of the royal family. They cannot grieve without spectacle. They cannot unite without division. They cannot face loss without reopening every wound. And as Catherine's funeral drew nearer, those tensions reached their breaking point. The palace tried to hold the mask in place, but behind it, the family was splintering. Some even wondered whether Harry would back out entirely, whether he would refuse to attend without Meghan. But Harry would go. He would stand alone. And the family, fractured and bitter, would be forced to share a space heavy with grief and heavier with silence. The stage was set. The fault lines were visible. And the funeral itself, what should have been a solemn farewell, was about to become the latest battleground in a war that showed no signs of ending. Because what happened when the world finally saw that empty seat beside Harry, when Meghan's absence became undeniable, would shake the monarchy once more. The tensions had reignited. The family was divided. And the funeral, meant for unity, was about to expose those cracks for all the world to see. It always begins the same way: a whisper, a leak, a headline. The palace tries to keep the mask of dignity in place, but the press, hungry, relentless, always finds the crack. And with Catherine's funeral looming, that crack split wide open. Public outrage, fueled by leaks from behind palace walls, turned a private grief into a global spectacle. The news broke quietly at first, a single line buried deep in a column. Sources suggest Meghan Markle will not attend the Duchess of Kent's funeral. Subtle, almost offhand. But within hours, it snowballed. Tabloids plastered it across front pages. Talk shows debated it. Social media lit up with theories. Was Meghan banned? Did she refuse to come? Was Harry going to stand alone? Pause here and think about the power of perception. Meghan didn't even have to be in the country. Her absence was enough to dominate headlines. The royals, by trying to erase her, had inadvertently made her the story. The public reaction split sharply in two. On one side, outrage. People fumed at the cruelty of excluding a wife from supporting her husband in grief. She's his partner, his rock. How dare they separate them at such a time, some argued. Memes comparing Meghan to Diana circulated online, painting her as yet another woman sacrificed to the rigidity of the crown. Others blasted the monarchy as cold, archaic, incapable of compassion. On the other side, condemnation. Good riddance, some wrote. She would have turned it into a spectacle. Old wounds reopened as critics recalled the Oprah interview, the Netflix series, Harry's memoir. To them, Meghan wasn't a grieving spouse, she was a threat. They believed the Duke of Kent was right to hang up the phone, right to protect Catherine's memory from being overshadowed. And in between, confusion. Ordinary people, asking the most human of questions. Why couldn't they just let her come? But here's where the real drama ignited. The leaks. Insiders, speaking in hushed tones to reporters, began painting their versions of the story. Some claimed Harry had begged the Duke of Kent to allow Meghan's presence. Others said the phone call ended abruptly, with the Duke cutting him off. Still others whispered that Meghan herself had demanded to be included, that she was furious at the rejection. Each leak fanned the flames. Each detail, whether true or twisted, became fuel for the fire. And soon, the narrative was clear. There had been a fight. A phone call. A rejection. A humiliation. Think about that for a moment. Catherine's funeral, meant to honor her life, her decades of service, was already being overshadowed by gossip. And not gossip about her. Gossip about Harry and Meghan. Gossip about the family feud. Gossip about a phone call that should have remained private. The irony was brutal. The palace had tried to keep Meghan out to avoid drama. Instead, they had created more drama than ever before. Now, let's turn to Harry. Imagine him scrolling through headlines, seeing the details of his private humiliation splashed across the world's media. Imagine the sting, the realization that palace insiders were feeding the press his pain. His conversations, his pleas, his humiliation, twisted into headlines and commentary. And Meghan? Her fury only grew. To her, the leaks weren't just betrayal, they were confirmation. The monarchy wasn't just excluding her. It was actively painting her as the villain. In her mind, the palace was working overtime to ensure she was seen as the problem, even when she wasn't there. But here's the twist. The leaks didn't just damage Harry and Meghan. they damaged the monarchy too. For every critic slamming Meghan, there were others slamming the royals for cruelty, for hypocrisy, for failing to live up to the very values of unity and family they claimed to embody. Public outrage became a storm. Petition drives, hashtags, opinion pieces, every platform buzzed with debate. And the more the public debated, the less they focused on Catherine's legacy. And this raises a haunting question. Was this really about Meghan at all? Or was she simply the lightning rod for a deeper crisis? Because beneath the noise, the leaks revealed something darker, that the royal family itself was fractured beyond repair, and that even in mourning, they could not bury their divisions. But the story didn't stop there. With every headline, every debate, the pressure on Harry mounted. He was now caught between two impossible roles, grieving grandson and public lightning rod. Whatever he did at the funeral, however he walked, however he looked, wherever he sat, would be judged not as Harry the man, but Harry the symbol of division. And the world was waiting, waiting to see that empty seat beside him, waiting to capture his loneliness in photographs, waiting to read every flicker of his expression as proof of resentment, pain, or defiance. The funeral hadn't even begun, and yet it was already less about Katherine and more about the family feud. The public's outrage, stoked by leaks, had ensured that. And so, as the black cars lined up, as the wreaths were laid, as the palace braced itself for the cameras, one question burned brighter than all others. How would Harry survive the funeral without Meghan by his side? The answer, of course, would come when the doors opened and the world saw him alone.